All right, so let's begin to wind down now. This time with our last conversation on the program this morning, we're seeing a lot happen in the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially in recent history. We're seeing the carnage, we're seeing the conflict, we're seeing the fights in that country. We're seeing how that obviously intervention was desperately needed in the country. In the middle of all that, we're beginning to hear news of how that the Rwanda government had been accused time and again of actually sponsoring a rebel group to, as it were, destabilize that country, obviously for interest in mineral deposits. And then one would have thought these are two African nations. If anything, they should find a way around their differences and all of that until the United States waded into the matter. And today we understand that both warring factions, both warring countries have now reached a peace deal, which the world hopes is here to stay. In the meantime, you're asking yourself, what exactly is the interest of the United States in this matter? Because this is an issue, a problem that is African continent specific. And they were asking, what will the U.S. be taking away from this and what is left for the Democratic Republic of Congo in itself? This morning I'm joined by policy experts who will help us to unpack what the real issues are in these developments. OZOEMENA, I'd like to say a big thank you to you this morning for joining us.
Good morning.
Great. So I'd like to ask, for example, how is it that when African nations have issues of this nature or magnitude, we are waiting for the United Kingdom, we're waiting for the US, we're waiting for China, Russia, and France to come intervene? Is there we're seeing a pattern to that, but what exactly are the underlying factors?
I think it's clear. In international politics, there's what we call convening power. So if someone is influential, highly respected in a community, and you have a crisis, and he comes on the scene and say, look, gentlemen, let's meet on Thursday at on Thursday, 3rd of June at the Market Square at Umuikem. And people know when they turn up, there will be some benefits. The benefit could be a path on the back. It could be a future, political support, because he has a convening power. He's influential, he's a community leader, he's a thought leader. So these countries you've mentioned, somehow, by the reason of history, by the reason of geopolitics, by the reason of colonialism, have some level of influence, even though the United States, for instance, didn't colonize any country directly, apart from Liberia, where it had it made effort to resettle freed African slaves, what you call Monrovia. In fact, the country, Liberia, they named it Land of Liberty. Then the capital of the country, Monrovia, is actually named after the United States President, President Monroe, who took that decision to resettle the African freed slaves in Liberia.
Right.
So, and for instance, in Liberia, you have the largest rubber company or rubber plantation in the world, around Nimbe, region, and you have a United States company that is a tire company owning it, and it's been there for over 100 years, and it's the largest tire company in the world. So you have U.S. as it is at the moment has a convening power. For instance, take the Israel-Iran war, 12-day war. U.S. stepped in, dropped the B-5 bomber, that penetrated to the tunnel, 300 feet tunnel. And the next day, President Trump said, look, I've spoken to the Iranian leadership, I've spoken to Benjamin Netanyahu, and they will observe a ceasefire.
Right.
And it happened. So there are countries in the world, by their influence, by their history, have a convening power. So that's exactly what the African Union, SADC, South African Economic Commission, ECOWAS, they don't have it. That's the raw truth. The raw truth is that they don't have it.
But isn't that a problem for the continent?
It's not. It's a problem in that when you have internal crisis in Africa, it can be resolved. Let's look at the Nigerian Civil War, for instance. The war broke out in 1967 with the declaration of the Republic of Biafra by Chief General Emeka Odumegwu. And the then African Organization of African Unity couldn't resolve it. Who were the people pulling the strings? You have Britain on one side, with its allies like Russia. Britain and Russia collaborated in that war. And on the other end, you have France also pulling its weight, because for France, they were going to gain additional territory, additional access to resources. What was the resources? The oil in the Niger Delta. Incidentally, there, you had 4 regions: Midwestern region, you had the Western region, you have Northern region and Eastern region. And what you call major bulk of what you call the Niger Delta, Bayelsa, Akwa Ibom, Cross River, they were all part of the Eastern region. So that war largely was induced by resources. Who controls the then just newly discovered oil resources. And the war in Liberia, for instance, were also resource driven. In fact, the American company in Liberia is Firestone. Do you understand? Right. That's the largest tire company in the world. And the resource comes from Nibe County in Liberia. So the crisis you also have in DRC is also resource-based. DRC, incidentally, has the largest deposits of whatever mineral you think that you need to, in this era, whether it's for electric cars, for batteries, for phones, for computers, they're all coming from there. So the control of those resources, it's very, very important. If you check what is happening in Somalia, for instance, part of the crisis in Somalia, since 1988, the last president or head of state of Somalia is Muhammad Farah Aidid, who was toppled, and the country had remained clearly in conflict. What is the resource in Somalia? Somalia, it's situated on the vortex of the Indian Ocean, and that's where you have the largest exploitation of fishery or fishery activities. You have trawlers, all over the place. So from time to time you hear about pirates, hijacking ships and all that. So someone somewhere wants that crisis to continue, because what it means is that instead of paying the fees you need to pay for fishing activities, you don't pay anything. So
because you have access to the resources.
You have access to the resources, because the owners or the people who are supposed to be managed, they are in crisis. So it's like when members of a family are quarreling, the outsiders will come there, go to their farm and take all the resources while their fight is ongoing. So that's exactly the situation Africa has found itself. But it's unfortunate.
Quite unfortunate, obviously. Let's talk about the M23 rebels and how Rwanda came into the picture, because that's a bit interesting. What's the angle of Rwanda in this DRC, turbulence, which we hope has come to an end now?
If you reflect, Rwanda had their own internal crisis, which most people has termed as the worst form of massacre, the Rwanda massacre. But then,
that's the 1994 genocide.
The genocide, the massacre. Paul Kagame, remember, was a colonel in the Rwandan army.
That's right.
Has a military background. What he just did was to reform, got into leadership, found a way of legitimizing his leadership, and got acceptance by the West, especially United States of America, and they provided a support. They were originally colonized by French, and Paul Kagame had to bring in a bilingual, policy. So now they speak English and French as a way of trying to accommodate the new investors who are likely going to come from the United States or Britain, so to speak. And he shifted his focus to the United States, and he got quite a lot of support in rebuilding the post-genocide Rwanda. But then, on the other side, you have Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. Remember, at a point when Mobutu Sese Seko was in power for over 30 years, he named it Zaire, Republic of Zaire. And the first Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was murdered. I mean, the history is there on 17th of January 1961. And that created, threw the country into crisis. What were his crimes? They say he had a leaning to the Marxist, Soviet Marxist.
Right.
So they felt he was going to become like a thought leader for the Soviet Union in the emerging African countries. Between 1957, 58 to 1960, quite a lot of African countries gained independence. So for the West, it was a receding of colonialism. So they also still wanted some level of control. So the next thing they did was to find a way of finding leadership across Africa that will, be close to them, they can control, they can have influence over. And that was exactly what happened whether it's in Southern Africa, where you have Samora Machel, quite a lot of, even the ANC in South Africa were accused of being close to the Soviet Union and all kinds of, so the geopolitics, the political environment started changing. And what it meant is that each African leader, whether in Nigeria, whether in Ghana or anywhere, started building alliances. For instance, in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah built alliances with the Soviets. In fact, he wrote a book called Colonialism, Neocolonialism, the last stage of colonialism, which sparked a lot of interest in terms of in the West, African leaders and across. It's a masterpiece. If you read the book, you can understand. He was saying, look, what Africa needs is a total independence. So between Nigeria leaned, we're still approach strings, if you may, approach strings of Britain. Britain was taking decision for Nigeria. If you check through the leadership we had in the post-independence in the 60s, they were all, the British government had absolute influence. If you look through the French countries across Africa, the French had absolute, influence. So back to DRC. For Rwanda, they share border with eastern part of DRC. So, and most of these borders across Africa also have ethnic affinities.
Right.
I mean, if you go to the borders of Katsina, Kanu, Katsina, Sokoto, Kebbi, they share border with Niger. So you have Hausa people on the part of Niger, you have Hausa people on the part of Niger, you have Fulani people in Niger, you have Fulani people in... So those boundaries, incidentally, are artificial.
Right.
They're artificial boundaries. When were they created? They were created in 1886 at the Berlin Conference. People brought a ruler and partitioned Africa. Should be German territory, this should be French territory, this should be British territory, this should be Portuguese territory or Spanish territory. That was how Africa was divided. So for Rwanda would, perhaps we're looking at the resource, if we align or provide support to the M23 rebel,
right,
and they prevail, we're going to be part of that bazaar. Because if you fight a war, whether an insurgency war or whatever kind of war, and you win, there's usually a bazaar.
right.
So perhaps they are looking at the bazaar, they are looking also at expanding their territory, because it's going to give them some additional new territory that is resource rich, that will also add to the economy. But my major crisis or my major issue is, why did it take African Union so long a time to intervene? In fact, the major interventions we had were coming from East African Economic Community, and then Southern Africa Economic Community, because they are in the vortex of that immediate environment, whether it's Tanzania, whether it's Uganda, whether it's South Africa, because they will be affected directly by that conflict. But the bigger African Union just sat there. And that was also what it did during the Nigerian Civil War. They sat there, they were unable to take a decision, they were unable to intervene or help, and then allowed Britain, Russia on one side, and then French on the other side. So that also shows you the weakness of what you may call the African political leadership. They are weak. I mean, how would a war, how would a crisis that's estimated by United Nations estimates over 6 million people had died, and they never did anything. The African leadership couldn't stop it. It has to take an American president, President Trump, who also will be looking at, look, we are trying to develop electric cars in America. We're trying to build our innovation ecosystem. And we need this cotton, we need these cobalt, we need these resources. So why don't we strike a deal? Rwanda is an ally of the United States.
Right.
So all they needed to do was to reach out to DRC and say, look, hey guys, come to the table, let's talk. In fact, if you watch the remarks of President Trump at that deal where the Rwandan official and the DRC officials stood, Trump was blaming, laid a blame on the past United States leaders for not intervening, to have allowed the crisis
to linger this long,
to fester for over 30 years. So So Trump has become the leader. In fact, I listened to a U.S. journalist who had covered the conflict for several years, speaking in the White House, saying, look, that President Donald Trump deserves a Nobel Prize on Peace. For that. The whole world sat akimbo, watched, African leaders sat akimbo and watched, and 6 million people were slaughtered. It's rather unfortunate.
So that raises the question of whether or not bodies like AU, I mean the African Union and the ECOWAS have not overstayed their welcome, because we still have a few regional bodies across Africa and all of that, even in East Africa, for example. If these bodies are not as effective as, maybe some of them not even half as effective, for example, is it not time we had to rethink Africa and its leadership?
I remember in 2001, I did a paper. I wrote an article that was published across newspapers. I syndicated it. Yeah, 2001, I remember clearly. At the formation of AU, I had done an analysis around what was the use of OAU and what is the use of African Union and what is in the name. Transmuting from Organization of African Unity, formed in May 1963, to African Union. What was it? I had argued, if you look at the European Union, formed in 1959 in the 50s, and where they were in 2001, where they had reached in terms of progress, in terms of creating a unified Europe. Today, I think EU is about 26 countries, or 25 or 26 countries.
That's right.
And they had created an economic union. They had created a monetary union. They had created an industrial union. They have even created a legal union. Such that as an EU citizen, all you need is one passport, EU passport, and you can travel around. Before then, I mean before Brexit, 26 countries. In fact, one of the things that triggered Brexit was that the British citizens were feeling, look, people come from all across EU to enjoy whatever benefits, social benefits that were available in Britain, because they have EU passports.
Yeah.
So in Africa, I mean, if you need to travel around the 54 countries in Africa, what you need to do is that at each point, in about 85% of the time, you need a visa. You need to apply for a visa to be able to get there. The African Monetary Union is not in place. There's no economic union for AU that is in place, not even for ECOWAS, for instance. I mean, we've talked about eco currency in the last 40 years.
And it has not come to fruition.
Yeah, I remember in 2004, the then Minister of, Nigerian Minister of Integration in Africa, you know, President Obasanjo in 1999 created a Ministry of African Integration. So ECOWAS fell under his purview. Was talking about that in 2005 we're going to have the eco currency, but it hasn't happened. But I'm sure you also know why it won't happen. The francophone West African countries have their CFA,
right,
as currency attached to France. It's a colonial legacy. They are not ready to let go of it. And here we are. I remember doing a paper for Leadership newspaper on that eco currency in 2004. In fact, the other day I was reflecting at ECOWAS at 50. I'm doing a paper on ECOWAS at 50. For me, it's a failure. If you ask me what has ECOWAS achieved, I will say 0. Because you just point anything. All you have is people meet at conferences, at summits, issue statements. That means nothing to the average person, citizen from the region. So I think we need to perhaps retool the regional bodies, whether it's African Union, SADC, EAC, ECOWAS, or Central African, communities. We need to retool it to become one, a tool to foster economic progress,
Right.
a tool to deliver results and impact on citizens, and not just a talk shop. For me, that's what they had remained at the moment. They are simply, perhaps, if European Union wants to relate with West Africa, so as to get a one-stop shop, it will simply go to ECOWAS. But the question is that what does ECOWAS deliver? If you want my honest opinion,
Yes.
they deliver nothing.
All right, let's wrap it up now on the final note. Countries like China, Russia, and the United States are tugging, if you like, at the heart of Africa. China and Russia in particular are doing that. Maybe Russia has the competitive edge at this point. What are the implications for Africa? Because it will appear with all of these factors that we're seeing. I mean, all these, as it were, powerful countries coming to the continent, trying to plant a foothold here. Africa will not rise.
Three things you need to understand. In global geopolitics, at every point in time, there's a continent that will be the most attractive continent. Africa has 54 countries. Africa, by 2025, will be 2.5 billion people.
That's this year.
No, by 2050.
That's in 25 years' time.
Yes, that's the projection. So, in terms of number of countries, Africa has the largest number of countries
On the continents.
across all continents. In terms of their GDP, it's huge, and they have young people. Europe, Asia, they are all battling with an aging population.
Right.
So Africa has young people, I think about 63, 64%. Youth bulge is in Africa. So that means Africa is a market for the future. So United States will be interested in getting a foothold. Russia will be interested, and China. But how does their interest support the ordinary Africans? It doesn't. Because each of them comes with their investors, investments, and expected dividends. I hear people talk about the Sahel regional union of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger as an ideal society. I say, how? Because you have Russia there. I say, how? Then, on the other part, the United States also has influence. They have, whether it's South Africa, Rwanda, quite a lot of countries that are under their wing. You could see from time to time the president of those countries rushing to Washington. And then, how does it benefit Africa? My worry, from experience of watching African leaders over the last, let's say, over 40 years now, I will tell you they are not good negotiators.
And that's a disadvantage, apparently.
Yeah, because they negotiate from the position of weakness. Either they are not trained in the act of negotiation. I listened to, there was a video about a certain Nigerian who had worked for one of the multilateral agencies. He said when they go to Asia, that it takes days to sign an MOU. But when they come to Africa, in one day you wrap it up. Everybody claps and drink tea and go. Now, they don't even have the capacity to review the content of the MOU. What is the need for us? I mean, we had a case in Nigeria, for instance, where the National Assembly was probing or probed the allegation of a contract between Nigerian MDA and China that was written in China. And you remember?
Well.
And there's no English version of that,
the MOU. Right.
So it simply shows you are coming from position of weakness.
I'm afraid, Emmanuel, this is the Motel Lao stake, but the conversation around Africa is quite a complex one, really. I mean, all of these issues about whether or not Africa puts its best foot forward when it comes to relating and interacting with the rest of the world is very concerning. And we hope we'll find more time to discuss these issues further. I want to thank you for your time. My pleasure. The program this morning. All right, we'll take a quick break. It is indeed our last break on the program this morning. When we return, we'll tie it up on Global Morning. Stay with us.